My name is Arlie Ben Lyman Hanavi, and this is the first segment in an hour and a half long study. Sometimes it even goes out to almost 2 hours. I was looking at the times lately, but it really is supposed to be an hour and a half. Segment 1 is Eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events. And looking at the screen right now, this is the topical schedule that I've been using. Topics 1 through 18. We're kind of right in the middle with topic 9, the yellow highlighted part there, Yeshua's Olivet Discourse part 2. And we've basically covered almost all of the chapter that I was anticipating covering. Go back and read Matthew chapter 24 on your own. Really, to give it the full weight of the topic, if I wanted to continue going, I would suggest that you read Matthew chapter 24 and chapter 25 when you're reading the listing in Matthew. Remember, however, that the Olivet Discourse sermon that Yeshua gave to his disciples that day has been recorded for us in Mark 13, Luke 17, and in Luke 21. So really to get the biggest picture so that you're capturing all of the details that the Bible has left for us, you want to read all three synoptic versions of the Olivet Discourse. But for this study, we only focused on Matthew. We also found that as we got near the end of the Matthew reading, that there were particular details that caught our attention for this particular segment as we're going to begin turning into Rapture Views in topic 10 and 11 and 12, a topic that is sure to be a hot potato for sure, right? But the details that I find a lot of Christians and Bible readers seem to focus on, besides the big kind of elephant in the room question about when is the rapture, is there even a rapture? But if there is, when is it, right? There's kind of four main Christian views that we'll talk about when we get to those next three topics. But what I found as we get down into Matthew's reading is that the issue surrounding the timing of the rapture creates the interpretation as to whether or not, when we're talking about people who are taken and left behind, like we read about, way down in near the end of the chapter, who is it that's taken and who is it that's left behind? And for this study, just as a review or reminder, I don't really want to go through the review again, but reminder is that after reading Tim Haig's notes, I'll just bring them up on the screen for you. I highlighted kind of the perspective that he takes, which is similar to the perspective I take, that if you look at the weight of the context, those who are taken, when Yeshua says two will be in one place, two will be in another place, and one will be taken and one will be left when the time comes for the Son of Man to return, right? When Yeshua returns to planet Earth. Well, according to what Tim sees and what I see, the context demands that those who are taken are the ones who are rescued, i.e. raptured, and those who are left to face the wrath of God, those who are left are those who face the wrath of God. So the taken and the left are designated as those who are raptured and those who are judged, the righteous and the wicked, respectively. Well, this is the way that the popular Left Behind books, Tim LaHaye and the Jenkins gentleman, I can't remember his name, how they both got it, how they both portrayed it in The Taken and the Left Behind. The Taken were the Christians, and then the book series follows what happens to everyone who's left behind to face the Antichrist and the tribulation, the 7-year tribulation, according to their perspective, etc. Well, what we're finding again, and we'll study this a little bit more as far as the timing, but we're finding that depending on how you interpret Matthew 24 verses, let me bring it up here for you. Oops, not there. Matthew 24 verses, basically 30, if I were to back up to verse, you can see on your screen, verse 29, and where it talks about the cosmic signs and then the coming of the Son of Man. Because the verse opens up with immediately after the tribulation of those days, after the tribulation of those days, Yeshua says, well, then for the pre-tribbers who believe that they're not going to go through any tribulation, this part of Matthew must be a reference to not the rapture, but to the second coming. I'll show you the chart in a moment what I mean by those two sections. So based on that, what we've been kind of entertaining with the idea is that if you don't interpret this slice of Yeshua's discourse as the second coming, but instead locate these verses within the rapture and parallel them to the Thessalonian passages like 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, 1 Corinthians 15, around starting at verse 51, things like that, 2 Thessalonians chapter 5 and chapter 6. If you instead parallel what Yeshua said here with what Paul said, and then match it up with the chronology of the revelation that John was given in the very last book of the Bible, then you're going to follow a view that this is rapture and not second coming. And with that, when you talk about the day that the day and the hour that no one knows, and the similarities between the days of Noah and the fact that the flood came and took them all away, and then it's that two will be here and there and everywhere, and one will be taken, one will be left. Because you're talking about rapture, then you can agree with what Tim said and what I am teaching, that, and I'll show you this last slide to kind of settle or to make it a little more easy for you to follow the theology I'm talking about. In rapture, Christians are taken and the wicked are left. And in the second coming, the opposite happens. The wicked are taken and the Christians are left. Of course, when I say opposite, in the rapture, the Christians are taken to heaven, taken to be with the Lord and meet him in the air, as well as the resurrected saints, etc., etc. But in the second coming, the wicked aren't taken into the air to be with Christ or any such place. Rather, instead, they're dragged off into judgment, those who are alive after the end of the 70th week has run its course. So with that in mind, when we go back to Matthew's rendering and we look now at where Yeshua says, but of that day and hour no one knows, what I mentioned in previous teachings is that this really stretches our understanding of which time period we're talking about, because in this classic pre-wrath view that you're seeing on your screen right now, which is a picture of the 70th week of Daniel, also known as the 7-year tribulation, even though I don't like that term, 7-year tribulation. But the last 7 years of humanity's history here on earth, just before Yeshua comes to establish his kingdom, if you're taking the premillennial perspective that I do. So I'm a pre-wrath premillennial, but from this perspective, at the far left of the screen would be the beginning of the 70th week, but not the rapture of the church. Instead, the rapture takes place on this chart somewhere after the midpoint, probably about 3/4 of the way into the 70th week or the 7 years, and then contrast that with the return of Christ at the far right of the screen, in which Jesus returns to establish his 1,000-year millennial kingdom here on planet Earth. Well, when we look at this chart, if we say that no one knows the day or the hour, we can only apply that saying to the rapture, because it is the rapture in which Yeshua rescues the righteous, in which he comes to rescue his bride, the church, and it is the rapture that cuts short the great tribulation that was begun by Antichrist and by the wrath of Satan. So we don't know when that rapture is going to take place. We just know that it will. It will simultaneously rescue the righteous and at the same time initiate what we call the day of the Lord wrath, the day of the Lord judgment, which include the 7 seals and the seventh seal, all 7 trumpets, and all 7 bowls, like you can see on the yellow arrow on your screen. And then moving towards the right side of the screen, according to Daniel, which we've seen on charts like this, according to Daniel, the exact timing beginning from the midpoint of the week when Antichrist breaks his covenant with Israel, his 7-year covenant, he breaks it by setting up the abomination which causes desolation, maybe some sort of statue or image in the temple, defiling the temple, etc., etc. From that midpoint, which is 3.5 years into the 7 years, at that point, Daniel has been given exact days counting down the rule of the prince, which is the Antichrist, and he numbers them as 1,260 days. So go back and read Daniel starting in about start in chapter 7 to get the context and work your way all the way through to the end of the book, which is, chapter 12. But pay attention when you start getting to chapter 9 and 9 and 12. I believe those two start to use this language of time times half a time, 1,260 days, things like that, the rule of the prince. Look for that language to show up in Daniel. And this tells us that from the midpoint to the end of the 70th week, we can count down the day. How do we say in modern terminology? We say that Antichrist days are numbered. He is given this 42-month period to have his reign on earth, right? Satan incarnate, the perverse version of the incarnation. Well, he's given this time period by God to reign, but it doesn't mean that God's going to allow him all 42 months to persecute the saints and to kill whomever he wishes. Rather, he's given these 1,260 days, 42 months, 3.5 years, and yet the tribulation will be cut short by the rapture and the initiation of the day of the Lord. Yeshua said it using language like, unless those days had been cut short, no flesh would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, I'm going to cut those days short. Meaning, I believe he's talking about cutting short the tribulation, but not cutting short the rule of the prince. Daniel says that the rule of the prince is 1,260 days. Well, Daniel also was told by the angel that until the destruction of the prince, right, the destruction of the Antichrist, it would be an extra 30 days. Of course, we're going to get details about those extra 30 days from the book of Revelation, so we're not going to look at them right now. But Daniel's just told there's 1,290 days. And then the angel continues with these details, and I believe these ones that I'm talking about now with the numbers, 1260, 1290, 1335, those actually show up primarily right near the very end of Daniel. Look at read the last half of chapter 11 and all of chapter 12, I believe, is where you're going to find this terminology. But Daniel's told that there are 1,335 days from the midpoint to not just the end of the 70th week and not just the end of the 30-day what we call reclamation period, but the end of the 45 days, which is the restoration period. I'm going to call it that. 30 days, which really kind of covers the bowl judgments outlined in the book of Revelation, and then 45 days to allow for the restoration of Mount Zion, which is in shambles, and the Jewish people who've been hiding out in the desert for 260 days, according to Revelation chapter 12, hiding from Antichrist and things like that. Well, the kingdom eventually gets brought in at the end of not just the 70th week, but at the end of the 30 days and at the end of the 45 days, which add up to 75 days. So we're going to talk about this time period here clustered at the end, the 35 and the 45 days, for a few reasons. Number one, if Daniel was given the exact days from the midpoint to the end of the 7th week, to the end of the destruction of the prince, to the rule of Christ, well, then when Yeshua says no man knows the day or the hour, he cannot be talking about he cannot be talking about the ushering in of the kingdom and what we would call the return of Christ, unless Yeshua was really stretching Daniel's language and almost to the point of disagreeing with Daniel by saying no one knows the day, right? Because clearly the angel knew the day. He told it to Daniel. He didn't say anything about the hour, but he clearly gave Daniel the days right up until 3 primary and very important events take place: the rule of the prince, the destruction of the prince, and the rule of Christ. So Daniel was given the days. So how can Yeshua say that no one knows the day? Well, it makes perfect sense if we take those words that Yeshua gave us in Matthew and push them back into the time of the rapture, and instead of pushing them away into the time of his second coming. So when we say rapture and second coming, we looked at this chart weeks ago as well, or we've been referencing it recently, that the coming of Christ, the parousia of Christ, is best understood as including 2 primary aspects, events, bookends, but not 2 comings. So we can have one coming spoken of in Scripture and affirmed by the Tanakh, the Old Testament itself. There's one coming, one second coming, not a second and a third and a fourth and a fifth, etc., innumerable. Rather, there's one coming, one parousia, or parousia is how I say it, and yet that event of the coming of Christ, which really is synonymous with the day of the Lord. Also, the language is mirrored. The events are the same event, really. The coming of Christ is the day of the Lord, is the day of Christ, is the day of God, etc., etc. It's the wrath of God that's going to be poured out on wicked humanity. Well, it's broken up into chronologically. First, the rapture, which happens, I don't believe at the beginning of the 7 years, but somewhere past the midpoint. and then it's separated by the events of the wrath of God that are poured out that we read about in the trumpet judgments of Revelation, the 7 of them, as well as the 7 bowl judgments. And then after the end of all that, after the day of the Lord has run its course, then we have the second coming at the far end of the 70th week, after the 30 days, after the 45 days, after the 30 days and the additional 45 days. So that's why, as you know, looking, here's another chart that does the same thing. That's why we can circle back around and say that rapture is for Christians to take them out of the world before the day of the Lord is poured out. And we don't know the day or the hour when that's going to happen, yet it is our blessed hope, because it is the resurrection, not just of the believers who have gone on to be with the Lord at this time, but it's also the transformation of the living believers who will be alive to meet the Lord when he returns that day, and his feet don't even touch down. And this is the blessed hope that Paul gives us in the resurrection, but it is also the mystery that was hidden from the Tanakh readers, from the Old Testament saints, the mystery of God catching away his faithful bride to meet their faithful husband in the air, to be united together as one big family with the dead in Christ who have risen and gotten resurrected bodies, and the transformation of our bodies as living believers. That's a mystery, not the resurrection itself, right? That was foretold in the Old Testament over and over. That's why the Pharisees believed it, right? That's why Yeshua taught it. It wasn't a mystery to them. It wasn't a mystery to Paul. But when he started talking about how that in 1 Corinthians 15:51, we shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in the twinkling of an eye, in a moment of the twinkling of an eye, then we'll be caught up to meet the Lord in the air. I'm transitioning into the Thessalonian language now. But we who are alive and remain shall be caught up to meet the Lord in the air. So shall we ever be with the Lord. I'll finish out with the Thessalonian, transitioning seamlessly from the Corinthians 15:51 into the 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. So that's what we're looking at right now, is this time period, and we'll deal more with rapture timing when we get to the topics 9, 10, 11, and 12. But for now, let's conclude this part of my study again by reminding us that, wow, where am I? Sorry, my bookmark wasn't where it needs to be. There we go. By reminding us that we've talked about this idea of understanding a bit better about the timing of the rapture, or the timing of Yeshua's statement where he says, no man knows the day or the hour. Is it truly that we're completely in the dark? Or can we really build a case that it's possible that what Yeshua is trying to tell us is that even though you don't know exactly the day or the hour, you should know the season. You should know the approximation of when I'm going to return. And then he gives us all these signs that point up to his return. He gives us signs and clues and hints that what planet Earth will be like in that day, as it was in the days of Noah. And he tells us about, it gives us parables of the fig tree and things that inform us of not maybe the exact day and the hour, but do inform us of an approximation of when we could probably expect this. And just before I jump into this particular blog article here that you're seeing in front of your seeing on the screen now, the Feast of Trumpets and its Christian significance, I just want to remind you that this idea of taking Yeshua's words that no one knows the day or the hour, and possibly seeing them as a possible hint of perhaps a return, a rapture that takes place in the fall of the year, that is paralleled by the themes of the fall feasts. We looked at this way back 4 months ago on my own in my own YouTube studies. It was a kind of a special fall feast eschatology show. You can see on the screen now. I've got my own YouTube channel pulled up, youtube.com/C for the word channel /Tate Torah Ministries, all one word written out. And you can go from my YouTube channel to the playlist known as Eschatology, Biblical Study of End Time Events, and from there scroll down past some of the thumbnails that look like the standard ones, which are kind of the orangish colored, and look for the thumbnails that are suddenly blue, right? They're just kind of out of the blue, as I'm kind of scrolling to show you, pun intended, out of the blue. As you're scrolling down from the first ones to the latest ones, you suddenly, your eye suddenly notices that there's some blue ones. All right, and you can't miss them. I'm even scrolling past them so you can see what I'm talking about. But looking at those blue ones, you'll see that the topic was Special Fall Feasts, Eschatology Show, End Times, and what? 3 Jewish feasts per Robert Van Kampen. And there's 5 parts there. So I'll leave a link to, well, the link is already in the description of these videos as to how to reach the playlist. But have those videos a look-see. All right, they average about 15 minutes long each. Go back and watch those in conjunction with what we're going to be talking about tonight.